Ms. Wahlström, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. Good afternoon. As I'm sure you're familiar with, in the next few days there will be a wide range of opportunities to speak both with Japanese representatives but also many others about the lessons learned from the great East Japan earthquake on March 11 last year. We have also used this opportunity to again recognize the importance of Japanese learning of disasters over hundreds of years, in fact, to drive the work globally that we are now doing in the International Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction on how to reduce disaster risk in order to preserve the development assets of countries and communities. We have learned that the Japan disaster is one of course, the most globally destructive ones. Last year, 2011, was the peak year of disaster losses so far in recorded history, with a minimum of total losses of $380 billion, and I stress minimum. Two-thirds higher than the previous record, which was 2005, with the Hurricane Katrina year. The last year's losses were mainly accounted for by earthquakes in Japan and New Zealand. Earthquakes are the costliest and the deadliest of disasters. And we had, in addition to that, several major events with flooding in Bangkok, of course, in Thailand. We had floods in many, many countries in the world. So the main message is that this is an increasing and very rapidly increasing trend with increasingly economic losses. Globally, the disaster mortality is in fact proportionally declining because countries are getting much better at early warning systems and preparedness. But the economics of disasters is becoming a major threat to a number of countries. I'll give you a few figures for comparison. Over 30 years, from 1989 to 2 years ago, 73,000 kilometers of roads were destroyed in only 19 countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. That's a distance 2 times around the circumference of the planet. During the same period, almost 64,000 schools were damaged or destroyed, including 46% in those disasters that are very rarely reported on: regular flooding, the high storms, the tornadoes, as we've seen in the US now. So we say today that 50% of the world population is exposed to disasters, to disaster risks, because they live in highly vulnerable areas. And I think that's the main thing to recall, that really development in itself poses major risk accumulation to all countries, rich and poor, but the poorest ones are, of course, the ones that suffer most. And I say this also with the perspective of the Rio conference coming along. The main message for us is there cannot be any development framework that does not clearly recognize and plan for the impact of risk from climate risk and disaster risk on development investments. There's lots of progress in the world, but I just mentioned a few figures that you may have heard from other briefings in this room. The 4 major drivers of disasters are environmental and natural resource depletion. We need, by 2015, the figures of what we need to feed our planet is 50% more food, 45% more energy, and 30% more water. All these are the critical assets that already today are under threat and that are triggers of disasters. 1 billion people today live in informal settlements, sometimes called slums. 1 billion people plus are hungry for food security, etc. And one of the greatest challenges for the rapidly urbanizing world is the fact that land use planning and urban planning is such a dramatically underutilized instrument for organizing cities that are really the areas for accumulation of wealth, but also the accumulation of disaster risk. Approximately 15% of all countries in the world, poor countries, low-income countries, report that they cannot make the benefits of that they are not able to use land use planning as an instrument to reduce risk. Only 15%, 85% cannot, and 15% report that they can today. A few things about Japan before I conclude. What Japan really showed us, in spite of the major tragedy, is that it works to reduce risk. Prevention pays. Building codes pays. Early warning system pays off. It saves lives. Drills, training, public education and awareness also pays off. It saves lives. If none of these things had been consistently implemented in Japan for decades, the horror that we saw last year would have been much worse. The tsunami was the main destructive force for the buildings that were destroyed. In fact, not the earthquake. It's a remarkable achievement for the quality of the buildings. But the enormous tsunami was the one that was so destructive. And of course, today, what the main focus remains on is that interaction between hazards and, in this case, a nuclear power plant. But it's not only nuclear power plants, it could be a major petrochemical industry that destroys the environment. So the exposure of highly sophisticated societies that are highly with critical and sophisticated infrastructure and natural hazards is really the perspective of disaster risk that we see developing very rapidly. So we take this opportunity to now start the process on the next Yoga Framework for Action. This framework for collaboration was agreed in the 2005 in January, just a few weeks after the Indian Ocean tsunami. Countries have worked around the world. 133 of them are reporting regularly on the progress to these instruments. There are over 80 national platforms. The job is to drive their disaster risk reduction agenda. And there are an increasingly very strong understanding of the economics of disasters and disaster risks. How much does it cost to accumulate risk for countries for the future? With Japan, and of course in recognition of Japan's enormous contribution to the first Yoga Framework for Action, we are now launching global consultations for what should the next framework for collaboration on reducing disaster risk, what should it aim for? What are the critical areas to now focus on? What type of guidance, quality criteria and investments should countries strive for? This is a voluntary framework for action, and it's entirely built on collaboration internationally, regionally and nationally. But many governments have in fact in the past number of years, and particularly this last decade, instituted legally binding frameworks, new legislation to try to really nail down the importance of an approach of prevention and risk reduction to preserve the stability of their countries. There are countries in Americas, for example, Peru and Mexico have very strong legal base for what they do, and many others. Philippines has it, Vietnam, Indonesia. All these major disaster-prone countries are really making significant progress, but they are not alone. The trend is very clear in every geographical region in the world, and particularly significant, perhaps, is that countries they haven't perceived themselves to be extremely disaster-prone, and maybe thought that this was a challenge for just some countries in the world. They have now engaged fully also. They have national platforms, they participate very actively, they have national legislation, and they make public investments in disaster risk reduction measures. So what we see ahead now is the next 3 years an intensive global collaboration on designing the next Yoga Framework for Action. Japan will host a meeting this summer in Japan, which is the first high-level conference where Japan will share the lessons learned from the tsunami last year. But many other countries are also now initiating their lessons learned of a decade of trying to reduce what is constantly accelerating losses of disasters. I will close by that and hope that there will be some questions for clarification.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wahlström. The floor is open. Tim? Thank you, Madam Wahlström. In your figure of 380 billion, what proportion does Japan make up in that?
Japan is on the list of countries that are most exposed, both in terms of GDP and population exposure. It's the number one in GDP exposure and the number two in population exposure.
It's $380 billion. Does it make up a certain proportion, a certain percentage
of total losses?
Yeah.
You know, one of the challenges which we are right now investing a lot of resources in is, in fact, to have a better counting of total disaster losses in the country. So, of course, Japan is this year the highest. And in a way, you would also say that the accumulation for the future will be very high in Japan, but they have taken such strong mitigating measures. So, from that perspective, a much stronger nation. But most countries today do not count their risks. They don't have a systematic loss accounting, nor a systematic counting of sort of minor disasters in their communities. And this is one of the commitments that countries have made themselves in our global platform last year, that they will intensify the work. Today we are working with 40 countries to introduce disaster loss databases. There are about 80 countries that have some kind of disaster loss databases. And we aim for, of course, by 2015 that most of them will have that. The way countries count everything else, unemployment, population data, we hope that this will become also a very normal statistical information for countries.
Ms. Wahlström, as you know, there was a severe weather and storms this year in Europe, and especially in Western Balkans. So I'm wondering whether the countries from the Western Balkans were recently started to talk that there may be a floods, and I believe that it was a statement issued by your office also. Whether they are counting these risks, as you said, and how advanced they are in that direction.
Firstly, they are all very active in our cooperation in Europe on disaster risk reduction. The countries in both Serbia, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, Slovenia, they are all very, very active, and they have a lot of expertise, in fact. Romania, Bulgaria, also traditionally very active. So, see, I think one of the critical things, and very positive ones, is that countries recognize that most of these things are not national concerns only. It requires collaboration with other countries. So a lot of the collaboration is sub-regional among them. It's collecting better data. It's looking for areas of... many of the rivers are shared between several countries, working together on river protection, early warning systems, public education, campaigns for safer schools. And what we try to do together with countries is really to localize action, to work with municipalities. And many municipalities in the Balkan countries have joined our global campaign for resilient cities. So, maybe a bit in the early stages, under also significant economic constraints, but definitely great determination.
Thank you. Do you have any sort of additional advice to them in which direction they should go after what they contributed in that way?
What we are mainly really focusing on is the local action, work with municipalities, enhance their capacity, ensure that information is easily accessible, an early warning system, and educate the population on what to do. But also we really emphasize the collaboration, because the big Donau River is not one country's river, so that is a Europe system. And at the same time, just now, there has been a launch of a common European early warning system for flooding, which is being tested now for the first time. This was something agreed 10 years ago when we had the very huge floods in Europe. So now it's being put to test and to see how it works. The European Union, in fact, has a very strong focus on disaster risk reduction and prevention. And they are also offering possibilities for financing and great collaboration within that framework, just as the Council of Europe. So with all these institutions, progress certainly should be made.
Masood?
Ms. Wahlström, I'd like to know, this Central Emergency Relief Fund established to meet emergencies, in your opinion, is this fund that has been established, has it been able to really help mitigate the crisis that is created after the emergencies and so forth? And do you think that such a fund should be expanded, in your opinion, and funded more?
You know, the SURF has a very clear objective, which is relief and response. So it's important once you have a disaster on your hands to provide immediate relief. The key to do anything about prevention and risk reduction is development. Only through integrating risk as a factor for development planning will there be any progress here. And that means short-term action, it means medium-term action, it means longer-term action. It means seeing development as a critical, sustainable approach to life on the planet, of course, but also recognizing all the risks that undermine countries and communities. So the SURF, I think the owners and the countries that have set up the SURF, and they want to preserve it as a life-saving instrument. It does not give any funding to risk reduction or development. Other resources can be used. If you're looking at the international aid scenario, most of the donors within that global framework, in fact, do have clear policies on contributing to prevention and risk reduction. And I think most of them are today looking at how can they increasingly do that over the development investment and collaborative investments. And their clear objectives, many countries that are highly disaster affected today are themselves making major investment in their development budgets. And that's the only solution. The solution is not what donors do. The solution is what countries and communities do.
SURF as it is can be abandoned. It really doesn't matter. Is that what you say?
Say again?
The SURF, as it is established, as you know, it is not necessarily
to change it.
Needed.
I don't think it's really in my power to suggest to countries that they should do that they should expand the SURF. I would welcome if they would put more resources into risk reduction, but I don't think that they should necessarily change the SURF for that perspective. They should use a more developmental instrument, because risk reduction you need a longer time frame than any relief operation provides you with.
Good morning, thank you. You continue to use the word development earlier and just now. And earlier you were mentioning land use development. And please do correct me where I'm wrong if I misheard. You said that, I believe, half of the countries where land use development had been diagnosed, it just wasn't necessarily possible in those countries. The Security Council is talking about Somalia today, and land use development has certainly been diagnosed for Somalia. What are the realities of Somalia being able to implement any land use development at all? And on a greater term, what sort of disaster risk does that nation remain under? Even though the famine has been declared over, I don't think anyone's under any illusions about how well fed anyone is there.
Each and every country can do something, and it of course depends on their circumstances, how far they can reach. But Somalia is probably the most dramatic example of where the famine has been declared over, but there is another drought signaled for the Horn of Africa. So the thing about drought, which is the one that, apart from conflict obviously, that is the most critical risk to Somalis, is that it's not a single event. Drought is probably the most misunderstood or poorly understood developmental crisis, because there's a lack in a country like Somalia. There are no institutions They cannot sustain a longer-term strategy which you require to handle drought. So today there are, in fact, efforts to support Somalia with some, perhaps in the larger perspective, minor efforts on strengthening the resilience of communities through investment in drought-sensitive agricultural practices, on better grains, on water management. And I think that's a good start, given that the stability is not yet really assured for people to be fully stable. But if you look at the part of Somalia that are not so dramatically affected by an open crisis today, like the Puntland and Somaliland, there they are really working on these drought management issues and water management issues, which is the major crisis for a country like Somalia. The lesson learned again and again for the international community that tried to support Somalia is, of course, we know there will be another drought crisis. So the anticipation and the measures that are then taken is, of course, what is going to prevent future famines from happening.
Matthew?
Sure, Ms. Wahlström. I just wanted to ask on the Japanese earthquake and Fukushima. There's been a lot of controversy, and I wonder if your office has any view of what the radius of evacuation should have been. What are really the lessons learned? Because there are many criticisms that people weren't informed of the risk, that the radius should have been 75 kilometers instead of 20 and then 50. And what's your office said to other countries that have nuclear power facilities in terms of what to learn if a country as developed as Japan could have suffered such an event?
On some of the lessons learned, and quite frankly there are many, what we've contributed is a lot on preparedness, on a multi-hazard disaster risk reduction strategy. And one of the challenges, I believe, for the Japanese when they had to manage this is that the people that managed the crisis, the natural hazard, the earthquake and the tsunami, were not particularly well informed about the consequences of what happened in Fukushima. That they are, and here nuclear power plant security and preparedness is not the only fragmented thing in any country. That's why I meant the petrochemicals. Some of you will remember the Bhopal. These types of risks are not normally, in most countries, not managed in the same structure. And the information sharing and the types of skills you need to have to manage these crises is too fragmented today. So that's, for us, one of the key, absolutely major lessons learned. If in the future, understanding the forces of nature and how they can destroy an urban settlement, that is not sort of uniquely an issue for the people that manage the earthquake and the tsunami. It needs to integrate all other aspects of society. So that's really one key learning, that the wider society did not have enough knowledge and information about the consequences of this. Plus information system, I think there was also a clear lesson learned. How do you inform the public about something like this when you don't feel that you have enough information yourself? What's the balance between saying nothing and saying a little bit? And these are some of the things that are indeed still discussed. And they are and we have to broaden them. Now, Fukushima is still, of course, a major challenge for Japan in every way. The economic impact, the shift of energy resources, these are huge issues. But in terms of managing future risk, these are the key issues. And a non-fragmented risk management system, it's information, is ensuring that the people, the significant senior officials that need to take decisions are well informed and well integrated into a system that gives them a range of options to decide over. So these are the questions that you asked, how do we advise other countries? It's still very fresh in the mind of other countries, all these issues, but when we discuss it, these are the issues we raise.
What about the evacuation radius? Just that specific question of does the UN have a view of, is 20 kilometers enough? Should it be 75? I mean, it seems like this is something that could come up again.
It will come up again, but it's not a blueprint how long the radius should be. It's event specific. You need to have the measurement. You need to know what happened, what is actually the radiation, and what type of radiation is then the one that falls out. You need to know wind speed, all these things. So you cannot, and certainly not in hindsight, you cannot say that this should have been this. Certainly not non-experts like ourselves, but it's a sort of a red flag of who has the information that allows the correct decision to be taken.
Okay, one more question, Harold?
Just to clarify a little bit, Mr. Wahlström, if I understood you, you said that, first of all, it is 2015 or 2050 that you will need 50% more food, 45% more energy, 30% more water in order to reach one of these Millennium Goals. So it's, did I understand?
50, yes. That's 50, what the global panel...
2050.
Yeah.
And would you put a little bit more light in that nexus of that trend, how they will actually jeopardize the situation in the world with this trend of reaching these goals?
From our perspective,
yes,
that work on disaster risk reduction, these are triggers of disasters because of environmental destruction. The water factor, whether it's surplus or shortage of water, is probably the biggest critical issue, and water has no price today, so we are very wasteful in the way we use water. At the same time, you know that today more than 50% of the world population live in urban areas. In another 30 or 40 years, probably 80-90% of the world population will live in urban areas. So in urban areas, the resources that need to be put to use to sustain urban areas, and it has everything to do with water for productive use, water for consumption, and water for agriculture. That's what produces food. So if there is a global water shortage, we have a major consumption crisis, and already today there are many regions in the world that are seriously water stressed, and where in the case of very poor countries it can lead to very serious food insecurity, malnutrition, chronic. But in other countries what it leads to is huge investment in managing the current water resources, so much so that it actually can impact the productivity of the countries. So this vicious cycle of what seems to be a rather finite resource base and people's sense of that development is something that has a linear and very strongly positive growth, but an increasing number of people in fact not being able to participate in that, that's where I think the nexus is.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Wahlström. It's been very informative, very interesting. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.